representative for Senator Larry Craig and Dr. Marilyn Levine from Lewis Clark State College. Real briefly, before we have our panelists give a 5-minute presentation on what their thoughts are on the presentations, just want to remind you that Senator Larry Craig's presentation was about the right to own and bear arms. And basically, he discussed that this is a Second Amendment right and that it is something that is guaranteed to the citizenry. He also was very clear in making the point that he believed there should be some parameters to gun ownership, and such things include certain types of guns that citizens can own, can't own, and also what you end up doing with the gun also plays a role in this as well. And Dr. Levine's presentation, she didn't form a counterpoint to gun ownership, but what she talked about was violence in society and how the structural conditions in a society can lend themselves to more violent episodes and more violent events. She talked about such things as population growth, resource depletion, resource competition, etc. And talked about perhaps that there are conditions in the United States that make it to where it lends itself in the United States to more violence than other countries that are industrialized, because we do have a fairly high rate of violence as compared to other industrial countries such as Japan. All right, on that note, I would like to start with Dr. Jeff Stodik and let him give you a little bit of what he thinks about the presentations.
I really enjoyed today's presentations very much. One thing I've always thought about the Second Amendment is people on either side of the debate. Does the Second Amendment does it serve as an argument to prevent really strict gun control laws? If both sides of that debate tend to emphasize their favorite phrases of the amendment. So I actually I printed the amendment off the other day, sitting in my office, I was just staring at it, and to me it's not clear. This is how it goes. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. To me, this does not clearly say you shall never have strict gun control laws. In fact, I'm not sure in this day and age what it does say. To me, it's not clear at all. And so, personally, for instance, the well-regulated militia part of it, I'm not sure if the gun owners in America constitute a well-regulated militia. But then there is that phrase at the end, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I guess my main point is, in 2005, it's ambiguous to me. And it does not serve as an argument against pretty stringent gun control laws. That's my thought on that. Also I want to mention this. As I was reading this in my office the other day, I was just staring at it for a while. And the word arms almost leapt up off the page. And this was reinforced by Dr. Levine's presentation today. What arms are we talking about? In this day and age, there are so many different kinds of arms, sophisticated arms, arms that can... I saw a story on 60 Minutes, I believe, the other night on the 50 caliber sniper rifle. Should we have the right to purchase and use a 50 caliber sniper rifle? Senator Craig said, I don't know what he thinks of the sniper rifle, but he did say there should be limits, and at times and situations there should be limits. But is he not making the case for gun control in a roundabout way, if that makes sense? As far as Dr. Levine's presentation, I asked her walking over here if she read Albert Camus. When I saw the title, The French Philosopher, when I saw the title of her presentation, I reread an essay that I read. Am I going over 5 minutes? Okay. I reread an essay that I read as a student many years ago called Neither Victims Nor Executioners. And it tied in very well with what you said. he does think also, I think you were saying this, that a threshold was crossed in the world wars. And a couple of things played into that threshold, the willingness, the killing logic, he calls it. A couple of things played into that. One was increased weaponry technology. It allows us to kill at a distance and not take responsibility for it, or as much responsibility. He also adds to that what he calls the religion of the state, how the state has overtaken religion and other traditional beliefs as the be-all, end-all. And you combine all these things together, we can commit atrocities without really thinking about them, certainly not taking responsibility for them. And he urges us to think about this. And if we do believe unquestioningly in the state, to understand what the state is doing and our responsibility for what it's doing. So that's my initial broad reaction to Dr. Levine's presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. And we'll move on to Tad Leach.
Good afternoon. You can tell the people that must not have far to travel because they're still here and not headed for vacation, the spring break. A little bit of background. I am a gun owner. I do have handguns, rifles, and shotguns. I'm not a hunter, and it's not because I'm opposed to hunting. It's just that having been a police officer, quite frankly, I like animals better than people. I am a supporter of the Second Amendment. I believe we do have the right to possess arms. I am no longer a member of the NRA. At the time when Wayne LaPierre referred to federal agents as jackbooted thugs, I believe it was, I cut my card up and sent it in prior to the first President Bush doing the same thing. I think on the issue of the right to possess arms, that you clearly have two extremes. One is that absolutely nothing should be regulated, and the other side that everything should be eliminated. I think it's a bell-shaped curve. I think the vast majority of us are in the middle. As we all know, no amendment is an absolute. The First Amendment, the right to free speech, as the famous Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the right to free speech doesn't allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater. The right to freedom of religion. We just don't let people throw virgins into volcanoes to appease the gods. So there are limitations on amendments, and there are limitations on the Second Amendment. Many people aren't aware that after the First World War, Thompson submachine guns fell under the purview of government control. There was such an abuse, as we all think back to the Untouchables and the mob. At that time, you could just buy a used Thompson submachine gun at any store like any other weapon. And because of this abuse, we started regulating fully automatic weapons, over 50 years ago. So, this issue of the Second Amendment being an absolute, it has never been. We also regulate, for instance, for decades, we have had restrictions on who can own guns. Convicted felons and so on in most jurisdictions, cannot possess a firearm. So there have always been some restrictions to the Second Amendment. In this day and age, I recall when I left the Chicago area, they had first come out with a high-capacity machine pistol that was being advertised as, having a matted finish so that fingerprints wouldn't show, and it had an attachment that would catch the expended brass. Now, being out in Idaho here, I don't think too many people, I don't think this was designed for the ecologist hunter that didn't want to leave brass out in the woods. Because clearly it's not a caliber that's used for killing Bambi anyway, and it's not the kind of weapon that's used for hunting. These are advertised and sold on the south side of Chicago, southeast LA, those kind of places, and are clearly something that is used extensively by gangbangers and people like that. I think there needs to be a common sense happy medium on what's there. Prime example at one point, and it's not guns, but it's obviously related, there were the, quote, cop killer bullets. They were Teflon-coated bullets that were specifically designed to penetrate body armor. Well, as a cop, I wore body armor. I mean, this was ammunition that was specifically designed to penetrate body armor. And fortunately, the legislature had enough sense to say, you know what, again, we don't kill Bambi with Teflon-coated bullets. We do kill cops. And so you can still use other ammunition to hunt Bambi, but these cop killer bullets are something that we're going to restrict. I think as the courts do, we need to look at interest balancing. I don't think banning the matte finish gun with the bag to catch the expended ammunition and prohibiting that is going to infringe on my right to have a weapon to protect my family, to target shoot, to hunt, or do whatever I want to do. So I don't see these issues as being an exclusive kind of thing. Either you can have restrictions on weapons or you can't. I think you can have restrictions on weapons and still faithfully employ the Second Amendment. As a former law enforcement officer, I think that we need an emphasis on enforcing laws that already exist, and that the judiciary should take a much more active role in dealing with violators of criminal offenses. I came from Illinois, the suburbs of Chicago. Illinois is not a right-to-carry state, and anybody carrying a concealed firearm other than on-duty military or law enforcement, that was a criminal violation. It was called unlawful use of weapons, UUW. And the Chicago Tribune did an expose, and out of thousands and thousands of UUW arrests, literally only dozens of people went to jail. I'm an activist in that if somebody is using a weapon unlawfully, they should pay a high penalty. And I guess I'll leave it at that. My next speaker is Bob Smith, and Bob's a fireman, and I just want to tell you, having been a police officer, I would rather face a guy with a gun than do what this man does.
It's interesting, and I enjoyed this, and as always, enjoyed being invited out to NIC and Tony's Popcorn Forum. These were always great. It's been a number of years since I've been here on this discussion of this topic, and again, it's nice to be back. So, a little background on myself, very similar like what Tad was talking about, his police background. As a civilian and police firearms instructor for 20 years, and having trained over 10,000 police officers and citizens in that 20 years. Matter of fact, I had a class last night that ended at 10:30 with 25 students. Over those years, you'll see differences in mindset or whatnot, especially in the training field. Generally comes from, is your instructor from the police or the military model? And my background has been more of the police model, hence my position goes more along that theme as opposed to the military's. Oftentimes similar subject, but different presentation based upon one's background. Also, as a firefighter and paramedic, I've been a firefighter for about 35 years in emergency services, 25, the last 25 was Spokane City, paramedic for 18, and a police instructor for almost 20 years, a post instructor for here, Idaho Peace Officer Standard and Training for a couple classes I teach there, as well as Spokane Police Department. So, a lot of my background, like the average officer who's been out on the street, this is not some esoteric mental exercise, quite frankly. When I go home at the end of the shift, I'm usually washing out somebody's blood and tears from my uniform. So this is not about semantics, and I'm not going to go into all the semantics of does a gun have a big magazine or a little magazine, or has it got a bayonet attachment or not, because it's academic, and it's absolutely pointless. The crux of the issue is human behavior. Okay? It's criminals, criminal behavior. And it's what they do with things. Our laws are designed to some degree, control behavior of people. By definition, criminals do not obey laws. Any cop can tell you that. And like Tad, I'm firmly entrenched in we need to have superior penalties for aberrant behavior. I personally don't believe people should get a second chance to go out and abuse someone else's child. In the years that I've been a paramedic, I have treated rape patients that span the age of under 1-year-old to in their 80s. And when I hear and I don't mean to generalize, but the social scientist position that somehow it was the victim's fault. If she hadn't been wearing that provocative clothing, something wouldn't have happened to her. If she hadn't been where she shouldn't have been, that wouldn't have happened as well. Now, I'm generalizing. Not everyone takes this position, of course. However, I've heard that over the years. I'm still trying to figure out what an infant in diapers was wearing that was so provocative to prompt a sexual assault, and the 80-year-old woman who was in her own home in her own bed in the middle of the night was where she wasn't supposed to be. As a result, in the number of years that I've trained, not just firearm safety, which is a component, but specifically judicious use of deadly force. We teach the whole use of force continuum with a heavy emphasis on when and when not to use deadly force. All 50 states and any other English common law country, Dutch Roman, Napoleonic, former Soviet Republic, have laws which are based upon your right to defend yourself, and if need be, to utilize deadly force in doing so. That's why we have justifiable and excusable homicide statutes. A homicide in itself is not necessarily a murder. This is why a policeman or a citizen using deadly force in defense of themselves or another innocent falls under the justifiable homicide criteria. No rational individual, and like Marilyn was talking, I believe we all have basically a good heart for the most part, although there are certainly members of the criminal element, the psychopaths, whatnot, who do not have that compunction. They do not share our concern for another human being. There's a reason our police departments are called police forces, not fluffy police, okay? Police forces. And the military is a military force. And that is because there are some people in the world, and you can't have it any other way, that this is what they understand. Countervailing use of force, including countervailing use of deadly force if need be to protect themselves. For many people in our society, and this is what our founding fathers understood, that is often employed by use of a firearm, which is the most practical means of countervailing use of deadly force, particularly when you have disparity of force issues as people are elderly, female against male, individual against multiple attackers, you name it. The gun becomes what Colonel Colt once said, the great equalizer. God created men and women equal. Colonel Colt makes sure it stays that way. All right. So, in terms of Larry Craig's position, obviously I'm in his camp to a great degree, and I appreciate his position on this subject. I very much enjoyed Marilyn's presentation, and I think the thing that struck me most is her aspect of war and destruction, which if you stop and think is not by individuals and individually born arms, but governments. I'm a founding member of an organization called Jews for Preservation of Firearms Ownership, and Aaron Zellman, who founded that, published a number of studies, and in point of fact, governments have caused more genocide, including the most deaths against their own citizens in the 20th century than any criminal or any criminal cadre or cartel could possibly conceive of. When you give a government monopoly of force, you get the Idi Amins, you get the Adolf Hitlers. Now, those citizens who brought Adolf Hitler to power and people like that were just like you and I. They had good hearts, they had the good intentions. But there's the old adage of the good intention, you can pave the road to hell with good intentions. And if you get an abusive individual who usurps that power and abuses it, we have problems for our citizenry. I have a picture from years ago of a Ugandan soldier standing on top of a literal human pile of bodies, a pile of human beings dead. As he stands on top of his helmet and his FN-FAL at Port Arms, it really struck me. Wow, the only guy alive in this picture is the guy with the rifle. Okay, and I'm being a little facetious, but in the years I've been teaching, we've had a number of gun saves, citizens and cops, and to this date, no one's actually fired a shot. So far more, the utility of the firearm, in my opinion, far outweighs the misuse. And on a final note, give you an example. When I go out and take care of a rape patient in my line of work, I don't go home the next day apologizing for being a man because some men rape. If I go on a drunk driving incident and people are killed in a car accident, I drive home the next day in my personal automobile. I don't apologize because some people abuse their automobile privileges and drive and destroy lives with those automobiles. Somebody robs a 7-Eleven next day, I don't go home and apologize for being a gun owner because some people are aberrant individuals with their firearms. Generally, in those cases, people who weren't supposed to own them to begin with because they're prior felons, and we still don't keep them out of their hands because we give them another chance. So, in note, the final note My position obviously is in favor of individuals being able to protect themselves, whether it be from an individual aspect or, as Larry Craig alluded to, a protection against whatever governmental entity or misuse may occur in the future. It's what our country was founded on. At any rate, that's basically my position. I enjoyed both the speakers very much.
Next, we have Andrew Mock.
Hello, my name is Andrew Mock. I spent 13 years in the United States Marine Corps, and I'm currently a student here at NIC. I'd like to start out with a quote by Thomas Jefferson. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect against tyranny in the government. I believe that the Second Amendment is really just another form of check and balance. When the Founding Fathers set up the Constitution, they wanted to make sure that the people always retained the power. If when you're making a list of things that are important to you, you normally put them in a sequential order on priority. So I don't think it's any kind of accident that it is, in fact, the Second Amendment. Now, that's not to say that I don't trust my government, but there have been instances in the past when they have not kept their word. If you don't believe me, go ask any Native American. So, if we are to just give up these rights, many very bad people in the past took away the rights to own firearms or arms in general before they did very bad things to their populace. So I think we need to keep them to safeguard ourselves. I did find it, you mentioned that with the progression of the technologies in the imperial age, that a lot of very bad things were done to different people. I think if they were on an equal foothold with their oppressors, that those instances probably wouldn't have happened. You're less likely to risk if there is more to be lost. And that is another reason I think that we should retain our firearms. As far as the Constitution says, a well-maintained militia and the right to bear arms, it's been argued that the National Guard has taken the place of the militia. In a way, that is true, because it is citizen soldiers that aren't full-time basis. But here's where the delineating factor happens. Those citizen soldiers are paid and are required to follow the president's orders. So if your president is the tyrant you're trying to get rid of, your National Guard / militia is not going to be very effective. I had a couple more points here. Oh, as far as deaths in the United States, since 1990, automobile accidents used to be below, here I've actually got numbers. All right, these are as of 2000. The number one killer in the United States as of 2000 was tobacco, okay? The number two was poor diet and physical inactivity. The number three was alcohol consumption. Then further on down the list, we have microbial agents, which is like staph infections, the flu. Then the toxic agents, this is usually accidental consumption of like Drano or something. Finally, the next one was motor vehicle crashes. And then after that was firearms. The point I think I'd like to make here is that it is my constitutional right to have the firearm, but it's not my constitutional right to have an automobile. As far as doing the most damage, I think that the automobile is doing far more damage than any firearm I have in my closet. It pollutes the air. It causes my country to go to war in other lands, to obtain oil. And I just don't, I don't think that the firearm in my closet is having near the impact. The last thing, I had one last thing, and it slipped my mind. So that's what I have to say about firearms, and I'd like to pass it on to this final gentleman here.
Panelists, what we're going to do, we're actually going to give John Martin and Marilyn Levine a chance to also make comments, and also if any of the panelists want to respond to what the other panelists have said, I'd like to do that. And after that, what I'd like to do is open it up to questions from the audience. And when we do the questions from the audience, I will repeat your questions, not because they didn't hear you, but because I'm on the mic, they can record it. Out in the audience, the mic will not record your question. All right, so on that note, we'll see if John and or Marilyn have any comments, and then if any of the panelists have comments about the other presentations.
Are we on? Thank you.
I just want to reiterate again how much Senator Craig wanted to be here and participate in this today. I know he would have been extremely comfortable up here with our panel members, all of them, not just the ones who have guns in their closet. But it's a real privilege to be here and participate in this forum. About the only thing that I could add, I trust all of you saw the Senator's video this morning, is that part of what he was saying is that Second Amendment rights don't exist within a vacuum. And it's part of society's responsibility to help define, what those amendments mean for the times that they are living in. And we do that through many different processes. The electoral process is one, the judicial process is another, that laws of the land are reinterpreted and reapplied. The Senator is a firm, as you saw, believer in the Second Amendment and all the Bill of Rights. And he represents those people in Idaho, the majority, that let him know many times on a daily basis through our regional offices that they support his position. If we were to find ourselves in a situation where the tide of public sentiment within the state turns the other way, I would imagine my boss would have a dilemma on his hands. Does he change his own belief system at that point, or does he, represent the people? And I can't speculate what he would do, but I think most of us would be rather hesitant to change our belief system. So he would probably find another line of work. But again, it's really good that we're having these discussions. I particularly enjoyed Marilyn's presentation on violence this morning. We weren't necessarily coming from opposite points of view. There were some tangential items there that is worthy of debate, discussion, and thought.
So thank you.
Okay, I want to thank you for your thoughtful comments, all of you. I thought they were, and first of all, I just have to say, I am absolutely in favor of any amendment you want to sponsor that argues to put solar batteries up there and let's not fight over oil, and send my students from Idaho to do that. I'd rather have them in class than in danger. So I'm happy about that amendment, and I'm happy to support it if you want to go and maybe do an internship with Senator Craig and start doing that. Also, the obesity one is one. I don't know if I'm willing to give up my rights to chocolate. But much of what's been said, I strongly agree with. I would like to just mention that as the chair of a social science division, I also have justice studies. And I'm very responsible and very cognizant of all points of view and very supportive of them. My argument isn't about the use of firearms as much about the culture of violence and how we got there. And because of the changes in technology and population, I guess to put it in a nutshell, I think we need to rethink and maybe think about the context And that's what Jeff was saying about the context of the initial amendment. It was during a period of revolutionary warfare, guerrilla warfare, in fact. And that is the origin of the militia concept. That's the origin of that right to bear arms, because it was it was a right that people fought with blood for. So that's the origin of that, and that's the context. But as Senator Craig is saying, the social context has changed, and that's what we need to consider. You all spoke very eloquently about that. I just want to make one or two points. One is I was very pleased you brought up the issue about what I think of as ideology, that one of the changes of the population pressure and the Industrial Revolution, how many of you think of, communism, Marxism, fascism, all of the things that allowed a Hitler to come to power, or a Stalin to come to power, or Emperor Hirohito to fight that war he fought? All those ideologies. Did you know that the word ideology itself is a late 18th century invention? It's not something like the religious concepts of Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism that came before. These isms are very, very modern. They emerge out of the Industrial Revolution. And I would add to that, and your point about the state was so important, I would add to that that nationalism is a very new relative phenomenon. Unless we understand how new that is, then we're not going to understand the reasons for warfare, the reasons why we go to war and why we fight. The idea of fighting for your country is a new concept. And the way nationalism operates is a relatively new concept. So I ask you to consider the concept of nationalism, which we take for granted as some God-given right, and it isn't even as old as the Second Amendment as a concept. It wasn't nationalism. In fact, it took us I've had this debate in China all the time with the communists, because they don't understand about the American Revolution, so I have to explain to them it took two constitutions, the Confederation and then the Constitution, to even think about being united. So I want to hear more from you, but I did want to make that point. And I guess the final point I want to make is a personal one. I was very moved by your comments about being in the field, and I am concerned because these are my students who do that too. And I totally agree with the idea of moral responsibility. When I represent this country or myself, when I go overseas, I do not take responsibility for other people's immoral actions. If people want to lie, if they want to kill, if they want to rape, in a way, it's not my problem. I didn't do it. I'm not the perpetrator. But I do think that as a teacher, as an educator, it is my responsibility to argue against a culture of fear and to at least raise the question of the social context. We think about the right to bear arms, but do we talk about the right of murder, the right of having that, which none of you endorse, I know, but the culture of fear that generates that? We need to think more creatively. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, are there any panelists that would like to make comments? I know Tad's got his already up, so he was the first one. We'll start with Tad.
Mine will be very short, and I realized I skipped over one thing that I wanted to emphasize. I made a comment about no longer being a member of the NRA, but having all of a sudden it dawned on me because Bob Smith in particular is a great example of the positive things of the NRA. So I started thinking about it and thought, gee, maybe I sounded kind of like I was anti-NRA, and I'm not necessarily, but as I say, that one statement I just couldn't in good conscience be a member anymore. But the NRA does some great things, Bob Smith, the safety efforts, and so on. So just a clarification on my position on the NRA.
Okay, thank you. And I think Bob wanted to make a comment as well.
Thank you. We're sitting here in an educational institution. I've been a teacher of a private school for 20 years, so obviously I'm a big advocate of us learning things. And that's how we're going to change behavior. It's not by banning things or prohibiting things. You don't fix problems by banning things. You can't ban stones and sticks. And before we had technology, we killed each other with that stuff. If we ever go to, one day somebody asked me, well, if we ever get to like Captain Kirk's phasers, And we can just stun the other guy, which we're getting to with tasers and things like that, which is great, because less injury to the suspect, less injury to the officer, et cetera. They're wonderful tools, okay? But the comment was, when you ever get to that, will you want to get rid of your 45 and your stuff like that? And I went, no. For the same reason in the old episode of Star Trek, Mr. Sulu picked up the little M&P 38 special and got shooting because he was a collector of antiquities. Sure, it was obsolete for his 25th century technology, but he still liked to shoot old guns, just like I like to shoot flintlocks, although they're obviously obsolete. And the gun I carry for protection or for police training and whatnot is more state-of-the-art, so to speak. So if we ever get to that point, in that statement, what everyone missed was the basic premise is that we will still have violence and individuals out there that necessitate some type of force, whether it be a phaser, or we started out with a sword, went to a flintlock, and whatever. Human behavior probably won't change a whole lot any more than it has in the last couple thousand years. I would suggest on the aspect of, like Marilyn's presentation of worldwide violence, particularly by countries and whatnot, a book that impacted me a great deal was by Christopher Browning called Ordinary Men. I would suggest you might want to read that. And that was a study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 from Hamburg, Germany. At the end of World War II, most military records have been destroyed. What they didn't hit, because of concern about falling in enemy hands with the failure of the Third Reich, et cetera, what they did not destroy was example of police reserve units. And many of the units that went in following the Wehrmacht in the Blitzkrieg, like through Poland and whatnot, were your proverbial baker, butcher, candlestick maker, citizen soldier, police reservist. And when they went into those countries, those were the guys that were, sad to say, going in and shooting people in the back of heads and filling up pits with dead, unarmed Poles. And the point he made in that was that it was ordinary men. Some people chastised him when he wrote this book and said, you should have called it Ordinary Germans, because that won't happen anywhere else. And his point was, it happens everywhere. And if you've been in combat and you're in a situation, especially when you're in a foreign country, and your family now is maybe that 10-man team or that platoon, and everybody else speaks a different language, eats different foods, okay, suddenly that's your family. And what happens, and I'll be trying to be brief with this, what Browning identified through these old police records and whatnot, was you identified three types of people. And Andrew mentioned, look at our previous history in the American West with the Indian population and whatnot. You had individuals who would not do whatever duty was ordered, an unlawful order, basically. I'm not going out and killing a bunch of men, women, and children under the color of law supposed this uniform gives me. I refuse to do it. I didn't sign on for that. The second group of people would do it, go up and throw up in their helmet later, but they did it because of peer pressure, whatever, and probably wish they hadn't volunteered for it. And you have the third group of men, which is when the day's over and everybody's going back to their racks. You know, I think if you escaped into the woods, if you issue me some ammo, I'll go take care of them. Okay? And in our history, throughout man's history, in any country, when the soldiers of that group, you have those three entities. You also have those three types in our general population, quite frankly. And that will probably never change. And he identified things in that book to answer the question of how did a person like Hitler rise to power? How could a few psychopaths become, it's very simple. We put them there. Every one of us, and we could happen in this country. Again, look at World War II. Had the Battle of Midway gone differently for the United States, I wonder how hard we would have been on Japanese interns in our concentration camps. So it's behavior, it's how things are dealt with. On the final note, to pass the baton here a little bit, when I grew up, and today we live in fear of crime. This gets back, like Tad's touched on how we deal with criminals. We live in fear of crime today. In our fathers' and our grandfathers' time, they didn't tolerate crime. There's a big difference. When I grew up, I had a three-bladed little pocket knife I carried in my pocket all the time. Why? Because my dad always carried a pocket knife. When I was a kid, guess what? I got into fights in the schoolyard, and we punched each other and pushed each other and did things. And you know what? It never, I can guarantee you, it never entered my mind to pull out my pocket knife and stick the other guy with it or cut him. So something's changed. It's not the tools. It's our behavior. And I do believe a lot of it is due to, we're human beings. It's garbage in, garbage out. We either learn properly or we learn aberrant behavior. And I do know when I came up in the shooting activities years ago, especially defensive-oriented, where we would go out and have live fire exercise and practice on targets, we prided ourselves on having to engage violent opponents, but not hurting bystanders, not shooting innocents, okay? when the video games started coming out, I used to do a lot of training in Vegas for down there. While we were on our breaks, my partner and I'd go into the Luxor, and instead of running and dropping quarters in the casino stuff, we'd go to the video arcade and play things like, oh, this is a cool game, Virtual Cop, which is a video game where two cops have to be your partners. And the only way to get through this running firefight, which would never happen in the real world, so it was a lot of fun to play, was you had to back each other, and the goal was the most point is to take out as many of the bad guys, and you got dinged for shooting innocents. And we pride ourselves on training ourselves and practicing to have that commensurate responsibility, which goes with that tremendous power that you're wielding with a firearm. Okay? Today we have video games of what? You get extra points for after having sex with prostitutes in the game, you get to shoot them. Oh, run over as many cops as you can with your car, you get extra points for that. Okay? There's a real problem with that type of gaming. The motto for my school on a final note for 20 years has been, it's your right to own a firearm. It is your responsibility to use it wisely and safely. Rights have commensurate responsibilities, and we don't always exercise them, whether it be guns or, as we've seen in some states, I'll pick on Florida, voting, whatever. Rights have commensurate responsibilities. We need to accept those.
Okay. We need to keep the comments limited because I want to give you guys time to ask questions. And so I've got two other people who would like to say something and haven't said something extra, Jeff and then Andrew. But keep it pretty brief because we're going to be running out of time.
I will be brief. We're definitely talking about a culture of violence and behavior and bad people, but I'll throw this thought out there. The tools we create affect us. You can't just say it's not the tool at all. I read this a little story. I'm not sure if it's true, but that doesn't really matter. The founder of the H-bomb, Teller, is that his name? He once proposed using the H-bomb to create an artificial harbor in Alaska. If we have the tools, we want to use them. Or the saying, another saying, if you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. So part of the problem are the tools. As far as a culture of violence, the question I always have is, the world is watching what we watch. You mentioned the media earlier. The world is watching they can't get enough of it, I guess. Why not the same levels of violence? The world is becoming smaller and smaller, but it is a good question. There is something about our society, and I'd love to hear your further thoughts you have, Marilyn, on that. But.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. Andrew?
Okay. I remembered my last point. Okay. It does say arms in the Second Amendment, and like he said, the H-bomb is in arms. So I don't, I'm not a proponent that the citizenry have access to every means of arms out there. I do think there are limits, like the bullets that are specifically made to go through armored vests, I think definitely should not be in the hands of your average Joe. And I definitely don't think that any average American should have any kind of weapon of mass destruction. But the thing I wanted was, you said manners earlier. And I think, civility and manners as one of your solutions. And I think that is one of the major problems, is people are not very polite to each other anymore. I mean, just drive down the road and see people flipping each other off as I think in the old days, when everybody packed heat, like the Western days, I don't think you'd see as much of that, because you'd be more frightened that the guy's gonna maybe, show you something different. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. It reminds me of Marilyn's last slide, more pie, less forks, and more manners. So it's a good way to end this. I did not introduce myself at the beginning. I'm trying to keep a very impartial view of this. I, too, am a social scientist. I'm the chair of the Social Behavioral Sciences. My name is Alan Lamb. And I'm a sociologist like Jeff. And so I've been very careful to not say anything. And I'm still going to be very careful not to say anything. However, I'd like to have questions from the audience now. Yes, in the back. Just a hair higher on that. Okay, let me see if I can repeat that. What you're looking for is a correlation between expressions of sex, sexuality, wholesome sexuality, or whatever the society defines as wholesome sexuality, and whether there's a correlation with that and expressions of personal violence. Okay, for the social scientists.
Can I answer that? The Europeans actually think the people in the U.S. are hypocrites because they're prudish, but yet we glorify violence. And I must say, I'm with the panelists here. I think we're horrendous on what we serve up on our media. I'm personally really horrified by it. Now, teaching this rock and roll class when the is it Janet Jackson? Mr. Timberlake thing came out. I was happened to be teaching about the 60s. My rock and roll as art and history class is not about the 60s. It actually takes it all the way up to the present. And one of the issues is about sex and about the right to have sex. Sex has changed so much in our society. When I was in college, if you lived in the same apartment as a man, you were looked upon as living in sin. Now, if people don't try it out, they're looked upon as stupid. And the parents give them weddings and everything. This is a very significant change, and the biggest change of all is the role of the father, in my opinion. The father is no longer there, and I have students compare Homer Simpson with Anderson, Jim Anderson, the insurance agent from Father Knows Best, because they're both from Springfield. And I have them do that, and it's amazing. If you look at the lyrics today that are so violent, that are so sexual, and so raunchy, sex without imagination. I dig what you're saying about wholesome. I mean, real sex is just real sex, but to dance around it and to just make it an obscenity, as opposed to a real feeling between people, has significantly changed. And look at a Disney movie like Toy Story. Can anybody tell me where the dad was in that? So when normal generational, healthy generational revolt, rather than being expressed against normative, family fathers, sons, when they reach 20, they want to figure out that they're their own person, is now being expressed against themselves. Now we have a culture of self-hate, self-mutilation, self-disregard, sleep with anybody, let your body be pierced, tattooed, whatever. Now we're into this interesting culture because they don't have the role models and they don't have the family life. That's one dimension of it. It's much more complicated, obviously.
Thank you, Victor. That was a good question. Gentleman in the red shirt.
Yeah, I grew up without a father. And I've grown up on the violent video games, the violent TV, the violent... And I'm a very peace-loving person. But it's like you're generalizing that if you have seen the violent video games, you have seen the violent movies, that's where you're going to grow up at. And when you don't have a father, that you're kind of generalizing it that you're blaming it on the lack of a father.
No, I think that's an excellent issue, and I want to clarify
Okay,
that.
hold on just a second. I want to repeat the issue
sorry.
for the
Sorry
camera.
about
Basically, he's arguing that he grew up without a father, played these games, and did not grow up violent, and he feels it's being overgeneralized.
Absolutely, it's overgeneralized. And I don't mean to say that my students are violent either. They are awesome, wonderful, and ethical human beings, and I don't mean to imply that. But what it is different is the mentality has changed toward the acceptance of some violence. That's why, and it's not students' fault, it's not your fault, that we have shows like CSI. And I think this is what my fellow panelists were saying. Let me give you a different country example. In video games, which Bob was saying were very violent, when in Taiwan, when I was there in 1981, the Taiwan legislature, although they were making millions of dollars selling videos to Las Vegas so he could play on his spare time, they banned the videos from their own country and actually picked up all video games in trucks and destroyed them as a bad influence on their own children in their own country. It was a very interesting point of hypocrisy for me, but an interesting one. No, you're absolutely right. It's very, very general, and I don't mean to imply that people without fathers grow up violent or antisocial, but the notion of the family and the notion of mores has changed. My generation needs to understand the goodness and where the ethics are today in the terms of youth today. That's why I'm so excited about teaching that course.
Okay, thank you. Was that okay? That addressed your question? Okay. There's a gentleman in the back that had his hands up for quite a while. Okay, the question has to do with is it not our responsibility to regulate? I think actually the mic back behind you caught most of what you said, which is really good because you said it very, very well. But it isn't our responsibility to regulate what's out there and what people are using.
I'd like to address that. Thanks for your comments, sir, especially for a young officer candidate. Having been a police instructor like Tad for years, we understand that. I see that over Spokane. And I have to say, the older I've gotten, the younger all you guys look. Last class I had years ago at SPD, I walked in, and one of my first classes years ago was an Explorer Post cadet for WSP. And a bunch of guys walked in there, and I talked to the sergeant and said, oh, am I in the wrong classroom? Is this my class? I said, this is Explorer Post, right? He goes, no, man, these are real cops, and they're yours. I thought, whoa, am I getting old? You guys all look so young. Now, the concern I have, and you have a very good point, however, again, and this is, you've obviously seen a lot of violence. I think some of us up here have seen a great deal of violence as well. Because of that experience as well, one of the comments I get from officers is also commonly misconstrued. Let me mention it, and that's because all of us, whether it be instructors, whatever, we get sometimes misinformation. The KTW information, for instance. KTW was the armor-piercing ammunition that you're all talking about, came out about the same time Second Chance started creating soft body armor for officers. At the time, it's the old adage from World War II, if loose lips sink ships. Okay, we tried to be quiet about body armor because the idea about being concealed and you didn't know it, meant you might survive being shot by some bad guy. Let me tell you where the KTW thing went south, and it comes back to the old adage of pogo, we've met the enemy in the ARS. A lot of times as cops, we can't keep our own mouth shut. And where that issue came to the public light was the California State Police, not to be confused with California Highway Patrol. California State Police was the Capitol Building protective group in Sacramento. Like most cops are curious, this new ammo came out, which is specifically designed. KTW is the initials, first initials of 3 individuals, 2 cops and a doctor. They created that ammunition to go through engine blocks and cars. It's coated with Teflon because it was very corrosive. It's a very heavy, dense projectile. As a result, it was real hard on gun barrels. The projectile was coated with Teflon, not to go through vest. It was designed by 3 guys, 2 cops and a doc. They aren't making ammo to shoot cops in the vest. They made it to go through engine blocks and car bodies. Well, like most cops, they don't take it for granted, does this work or not? So the cops up there in the Capitol said, hey, wonder if this stuff will go through our vest, these new vests we're getting. They shot them. Sure it did. They went and publicized it. Other police groups, and also don't tell the media about this. The bad guys don't know we're wearing these vests. By opening our own mouths, we started putting this word out, and then it got carried by other news media and whatnot. And you know what started happening? Exactly what we were afraid of. The bad guys started going up and shooting cops in the head. And why? He comes back and says, well, we saw about that body armor or something. You ain't got no body armor on your head. So KTW, the so-called cop killer bullet, was not designed to go through vest. Okay, and that was the actual story of it. And it was never available to the general public. It was specifically a law enforcement or military round only. And a final question, your comment, sir. It's very easy in these discussions to generalize about our whole discussion, and we don't mean to do that. None of us mean to generalize. There's so many things. I have a brother. He was raised by the same parents as my sister and I, and he's the black sheep of the family and borders on criminality, and we were all raised the same. What happened? Who knows? Okay? But as far as the firearms, sir, on the street, there are a lot of different firearms on the street by criminals, by individuals. As a medic, when I go on calls, you know what? The rare time I go on accidental shootings with guns and whatnot, far less than automobile accidents and whatnot, it's the same group of people that have the same lack of responsibility with their entire life. You walk in that house, the whole life screams irresponsibility, and the gun just happened to be the other thing they picked up and were irresponsible with. So I don't know that, let's put it this way, the utility for most people outweighs the abuse of firearms, just like we accept the utility of firearms outweighs the abuse of cars. As a cop instructor, I don't want to see you go on the street and face anything worse than you have to do, without a doubt. But we're all cut from the same cloth, human beings, and that's what it's about. I got a video just the other day from from ILFE. I'm an International Association of Law Enforcement Firearms Instructors. And the video shows a young officer, a narcotics cop back in Chicago, standing right in front of a group of kids talking about stay away from drugs, stay away from guns. He does them properly. I know you've seen this, Tad. On the end of these words, I'm the only individual in this classroom professional enough to carry the Glock 40, bang, shoots himself in the hip. All right, he's a human being. Obviously, there was a lack of training somewhere or something there on basic firearms handling, so much for only cops should have guns. But anyway, does that address your...
I think I got it. Is this thing working? All right. Where you're coming from is you're wanting to know how are all these people getting these guns? I mean, how does a 15-year-old get an AR-15? All right? Well, basically, there's some kind of criminal element that's selling these guns to these guys. I mean, they're obviously not selling them through the legal ways, because you have to be background checked, make sure you're not a felon. So, and the big problem, I think, comes back to what these guys said earlier. They'll catch somebody in the act of selling illegal arms to somebody. The guy does 2 years in jail, and he's out again, and he's doing the same dang thing. Do you have a little more? Right.
But the excess.
Right.
Comment on that.
Stopping it at the source before it even gets delivered to the street to be sold.
I understand that, and I appreciate that. But you look at you look at all the old history, Norco bank robbery in L.A., the recent thing with the two guys on the bank robbery. The problem you have is just like when you make a big drug bust. They get some speedboat full of narcotics, whatnot. Guess what's on that boat too? AK-47s, whatever else. So you can ban private production or whatever you want. You can attempt to, whatever, okay? And you can still import illegally with the cocaine cowboys, local drug shipment, the guns. So where these are coming from is they're not coming from normal commerce other than, unless you have a situation like the kid recently up at the reservation, a gun box or something. And right now, if we don't do that, you have kids who kill their grandfathers, the police officers steal all their guns and go kill people. You have kids who access firearms aren't properly secured. You have criminal adults access firearms and gain them in those methods. The guy that opens up the trunk on the street corner, we need to do something with him.
This is a bigger problem than we're going to be able to solve, but I do want to mention something, and that is your passion and your care and your concern about these issues is what's going to help drive change. And I want you to keep that passion up because that's good passion. Okay.
I had one quick comment. When I said I have my guns in my closet as a figure of speech, I actually do have a gun safe as well. But because I don't want somebody coming in there with a lot of money. So I was in Somalia. Okay, I'm sure some of you guys have seen the movie Black Hawk Down.
I'll get him.
I was there up to a week before that happened. And you would not believe the amount of firearms just coming across the border. We would go and exchange firearms for food. And we're not just talking rifles. I mean, I was getting rocket launchers. I'm getting the whole mines, you name it. And as fast as we were taking them off the street in Mogadishu, we'd take one off and 10 would replace it. I had about a 6-year-old kid point a .45 at me. All right, so then you're in the dilemma, well, do I shoot this guy or do I let this little kid, shoot me? The weapons coming in the streets, I would probably venture to say that the majority of them aren't even coming from internally. Most of those weapons are coming in across the border. And, I mean, how many illegal aliens do we have in the country? All right? If people can get across, you sure the heck can get guns across the border.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the first.
And okay, and that's a good point, well taken. Stopping it at the starting point for where the distribution for weapons occurs, especially illegal distribution. The gentleman in the black leather coat over there. Okay, the question is, if we cannot stop them getting the guns, if we cannot stop the violence on the media and the violence that they're being taught, that kids are being taught, what can we do to educate kids against guns? Is that correct? Start with Marilyn.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question, and it leads in with your friend's question over there. I think and it sounds hokey, but the reality is to treat each other as human beings who are responsible for themselves and to educate and to take people's reality. I think the biggest thing my generation could do is to do a reality check on the culture and on the communication process today. I unite a class of 60 students in this one class I'm talking about. I'm there in the trenches. And then what I do is I go around throughout Idaho, and I hold workshops for teachers on rock and roll and using it in the class to start a dialogue about violence, about obscenity, about, you know, the question about sex, for example. I mean, I actually talk about it, and and it's so intrinsic in it. So I think education is it. And I'd like to say, as an example of that, I spend a lot of time on technology myself. I have 12 websites, and I oppose the plagiarism and the cheating and the misinformation is that there. My responsibility, and that's all I can speak for, is to stand up for moral and for honest and for interesting usage. I think the more interesting I can make my classes, the more interesting I can make my websites, the better I model the behavior, because I believe in you. And that's my answer.
Thank you, Marilyn. And Andrew, you had your mic up too.
You know, when I was a kid, my high school actually had a ROTC unit, and we actually had guns at school. We went and shot 22 caliber rifles, and it was a matter of pride to I mean, I think when I was 10, I went to my first gun safety class. We're willing to teach our children about safe sex, but are we willing to teach them about handling a tool safely? I mean, I no more would want to put a chainsaw into a kid's hand as I would a gun if he didn't know what the heck he was doing with it. So I think it's an educational problem, you know? We don't just let people go and drive cars without having them learn how to do it first. So I think if we educated our children to know that, hey, okay, here we go. The simple rules my father taught me. Rule number 1, you don't ever point a gun at anything you don't plan to kill. If you do plan to kill it, what are the reasons? A, self-defense. B, you plan to eat it. Or D, it's a pest like a mouse or a cockroach, right? I remember getting a BB gun and I shot a robin. My dad made me eat that robin, okay? So maybe that goes back to the father influence. I don't know. There are times to use force and there are times not. And there should be strict rules and that people should be taught and indoctrinated those rules.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. The gentleman in the green shirt. Okay, the gentleman in front of the gentleman.
Yeah, you had a slide up this morning comparing Japan and the U.S.
Yeah, unfortunately it was in red.
6.5 years in Japan, and there's a huge difference in sociology and culture
Big
between
time.
Japan and the U.S. And I think that has a whole lot more to do with there's reduced crime rate than anything else.
In fact, go ahead. He's mentioning the sociological difference between Japan and the United States. Absolutely correct. And in fact, if you look at their history of war atrocity in the 20th century, particularly the rape of Nanjing and what they were willing to do as far back as the Russo-Japanese War, an entirely different phenomenon of internal and external violence, willing to do it on the external level, but not on the internal level. I think that guy there should have his question. He's so patient behind you. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, part of it was in relationship to what he said, ties into what this young man said, and ties into what this young man said. And I think that, you know, a lot of what people are talking about with gun control. Here, I'm sorry, my name's Don Delpham. I'm a student of Tony here. And I'm a tail-end baby boomer. I've had relatives that were killed in engagements all the way to Waterloo. Okay, Vietnam. I've had relatives that have fought in the Pacific, in Europe, and all that. I have guns, but they're relics too. But I have 4 boys that I'm raising in this society, and I think that it is the education and the example that the children need to solve the violence problem in our country, which is way too permissive. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes here, and then I'm going to get off and allow you to comment. Okay? 1965, this is by Senator Patrick Moynihan in the Warren Report to Congress. This is right after they came up with no-fault divorce. You might see where I'm going with this. From the wild Irish slums of the 19th century eastern seaboard to the riot-torn suburbs of Los Angeles, there is one unmistakable lesson in American history. A community that allows a large number of young men to grow up in broken families dominated by women, never acquiring any stable relationship to male authority, never acquiring any rational expectation about the future. That community asks for and gets chaos. One more. And this was quoted by Rosie Milligan, Los Angeles Sentinel. She stated that in her article about youth violence in America. 63%, and I've condensed this, 63% youth suicides, 90% of all homeless and runaway children, 85% of all children with behavioral problems, 71% of all high school dropouts, 75% of all adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers, 70% of juveniles in institutions, 85% of all youth sitting in prisons, all come from fatherless homes. I came from a fatherless home. I was in jail my first day of high school. I brought weapons to school because I was afraid of what other kids did to me. And this is in the segregated South. Okay? And what I want to tell you, what changed me, I didn't want to have children. But when I had children, it did something to me. And I wanted them to have what I didn't have, a father there. My wife chose to have the no-fault divorce. My children had to pay for the consequences I did. I was homeless at 40 years old after providing my family with 3 homes by my own hand. Okay? We had a house, a car, and we lived on a poverty-level income. But we were good people. And the thing I learned, and where I learned to treat people, actually out in California, if you can believe that, I started reading a book that's pretty much been banned out of the schools, the Bible. And I read it for myself. I listened to all these kook preachers and all these other things, and I started thinking, hey, you know what, maybe this born-again stuff is different. You know, it's really a relationship thing and not a religion thing that starts wars. You have to have the relationship. I have the relationship with my children, and I'm there for them, and I'm there to explain them why we have these things, why we have these rights, and the proper use of force when and where. And if you want to change this, we need to help preserve the family unit and not destroy it just because everybody has the right to do whatever they want to. Thank you.
I'll comment on that.
Thank you very much. And this theme of family has risen several times in the discussion in Maryland, and I see a lot of people want to comment real briefly on this. I do. Right, Maryland does have to go for a TV show, so.
Us up-and-coming movie stars, what can we say? But I do want to say that, and what's your first name there?
Don.
Don. So, Don, you liked my Confucius quote in The Great Learning, and you can find that on the political science lesson of my website in the Intro to Social Sciences, and read it to your children because it talks about families. But, yeah, I mean, I have to say, so, you know, just the title, Desperate Housewives? I mean, let's talk reality. Is this what women have come to? That the portrayal of them are just sex objects or desperate housewives or people who can't accomplish something or can't be mothers or can't be, you know, this way? There's a wide array of what we can do. And I just think it comes again, and I iterate what Don said, to modeling. And if you have a value, whatever it is, whether you're Hindu or Christian or whatever, live by it.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. And Marilyn has to leave with Tony. We'll stick around for a little while longer, and I know that Tad's wanting to say something over there.
You know, I think, again, it goes back to talking about responsibilities. And I guess I'm going to show my age a little bit because I grew up before the entitlement age. You know, I went back to the age when my parents taught me I was entitled to one thing as an American, and that was opportunity. Now, what I did with it was my responsibility. And, you know, we are a society today. When I was a juvenile officer in the first police department I worked for, I spent my entire career looking for Ralph, because nobody in my town that was a juvenile ever did anything on his own. It was always Ralph's fault. And so I kept trying to track Ralph down. I could never find him, but they were never responsible for what they did. It was always somebody else. I grew up in poverty or this, that, and the other thing. So did Colin Powell. You know, we tend to today not to want to accept responsibilities. You know, my lovely wife we just had our 39th anniversary. You know, we've had our share of problems too, but you know, again, responsibility. You work through your problems. You know, you don't just get to that point where you have the fight and okay, I'm out of here and we'll do something else, or take responsibility for your children and so on. So I think it gets back a little bit that we need to hold people accountable, and certainly, and that's, I think everybody up here was, you know, certainly the bad guys too. When we talk about the abuse of weapons, we need to hold those people accountable and responsible to protect the rest of us in society. And I wish I had a good answer, because again, that issue of responsibility is just something that to me permeates our society. We don't want to accept responsibility for what we do.
Thank you, Tad. Bob?
Twofold. For the two questions there, the one young guy asked about, what are we going to do? What's the answer? And I'm a firm believer in educate, not legislate, which is why I support guys like Larry Craig, because as was pointed out by John here, it's not so much up there passing laws, it's keeping a whole bunch of other garbage from being passed. And the problem is, every time we have a problem, we want to pass some law. And again, if you don't have personal, individual responsibility and accountability, it doesn't matter what laws you pass if people aren't going to take responsibility. From an educational standpoint, when I started my school years ago, and I'm not trying to, you know, pimp my school there, but the name is Security Awareness and Firearms Education for a reason. It's about a heightened sense of security awareness. It's about firearms education. And to answer the question of that young guy, like many other teachers in this room, for 20 years, that's been my goal, is try and teach people proper use. I've done that with all aspects, cops, citizens, kids, whatever. I had one woman years ago go, well, you're teaching these children stuff. You're brainwashing them. I said, yes, ma'am, I am. And she looked at me, what? I said, I am brainwashing them, because after what they see on TV and they experience everywhere, their brains are polluted. Their brains need washing. So what I'm trying to do is counter the constant onslaught. And as a teacher, as everyone up here sits and knows, it's tough to counter with a class you teach on an occasional basis, the constant inundation by the general media, whether it be movies, TV, etc. Okay, so we are trying to wash some brains, quite frankly. They need it, all right? So all you can do is, like many of us try to do for our adult careers, is we try and teach the proper usage, the responsibilities that go with ownership of firearms, etc. But again, it comes back to that basic aspect, and as I was raised, as many of us here, personal responsibility, accountability, and a simple thing, the golden rule. Treat other people like you'd like to be treated. Forget guns or anything else. Be civil to people. Be polite to people. And do you want to be beaten or assaulted? No. Why do we do that? There are people who don't live by the golden rule. They live by aberrant behavior and prey upon other people, predatory man. And they will always be with us.
Thank you, Bob. And then John had a comment, and then we have another question out there.
I'll keep this brief. I normally am very quiet in these kind of venues, because more than likely there's a media person, and it gets back to my boss. Do you know what your guy said? So I will preface this by saying this is me speaking, not Senator Craig. My background is I'm a retired Air Force officer of 24 years, former high school teacher, college instructor, who just happens to have a really great job right now. And I think a lot of what you're talking about relates to how we view the role of government in our daily lives. There are those who think that government should provide for our every want and need, which removes any incentive for personal responsibility. My boss happens to believe it's just the opposite, that the less government we have, the better we're off, and more responsibility than we have to take as citizens. So without making this a paid political announcement, I'd say that supporting, if you believe that we are personally responsible for the choices we make, then you have to elect officials that share those value systems that you do.
Thank you, John. Okay, I had a couple more people with questions. This gentleman, and then we'll go over to the right here.
Referring to going back to gun control, do you feel that our laws need to be stricter on getting a gun? Because to be honest, it's quite scary. You know, the kid that did the shooting in Minnesota, he wasn't a felon. And when you get by a gun, one of the things, if you're a felon, you can't own a gun. But it's very scary because I, for instance, can walk into Big Five or Black Sheep and buy a gun and take it to school because I was made fun of. And I know you want to educate, the kids crazy, not all up here, but should it be stricter? Should we let the FBI do a background check? Or how would we approach that?
How
Okay.
old are you, sir, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 18.
Okay, you can't walk in, for instance, and buy a handgun.
Not a handgun, but I can sure go buy a shotgun.
You can, indeed, okay, and you're not going to always address someone who doesn't have a criminal background, just like the young man in Minnesota, there's no question about it. And you can't, we can all look in 2020 hindsight and say, oh, that guy dressed funny, and he said funny things, and he drew horrible pictures of people killing each other. It's like around April 15th. Everybody wants to blow up the IRS, too. But most people don't act on it. So it's real tough to see which one, for law enforcement, which one's going to be the problem. It's tough to see, but I don't think we should wash away most people's civil rights and the ability to protect themselves because of the occasional aberrant individual. That's a part of a free society, just like our freedom of the press, just like all the other things we do. There are trade-offs for those freedoms.
Okay, for the record, the question was, should we have stricter gun laws? And that was the response to it. Okay, thank you. And the lady back there?
Could I add something in on that?
Oh, wait a minute. One last.
Kind of like I think what several of the gentlemen up here said is, every time something happens, we always want to pass a new law. And we forget, if you look at the laws that are on the books currently, and I can speak more of Illinois. For instance, in Illinois, it's an additional offense if you commit a crime and are armed. Not even that you have used the weapon, but just that you have a weapon with you when you are, say you're committing a burglary, and you are armed. Don't have to use the gun. It's an additional crime with severe penalties. The unfortunate part is that people get arrested and, well, they didn't use the gun on him, and he hasn't killed anybody yet, so we'll put him on extend his probation, kind of thing. The laws that are on the books are very effective. It's how we deal with them. It's the enforcement, it's the judicial system, et cetera, et cetera. There are some great laws on the books to deal with these people that are abusing the privileges we have under the Second Amendment. So, personally, I think at this stage it's more deal with the laws that we have before we think about enacting some new ones and additional ones.
Okay, we'll move over to the question over here. I did want to mention one thing just in connection to the gentleman's question. I was at a yard sale probably last spring, and they had a lot of guns for sale at the yard sale. And there was a teenager buying one of the guns. The person at the yard sale wasn't checking ID, was not checking whether or not they were a felon, and legally could sell a gun at a yard sale. And so guns are pretty easy to get. And if you make stricter laws, people are probably going to figure out how to get around them if they are doing it for illegal purposes to begin with. So it's a difficult issue, it really is. Okay, question back there. Okay, the question is are any of the people up here against personal handguns in the home? Is that correct?
Owning one legally? No.
Okay, the comment is the same view because everybody up here supports legally owning a gun. Does anybody not?
My main point was that I don't think the Second Amendment prevents us constitutionally from perhaps enacting stricter gun control laws. That's my, and I think I am in favor of stricter laws. I don't know how you do this in the U.S. We're a republic and states' rights and all that kind of thing. But ideally, I would love to have every gun registered, licensed, and training required. That kind of thing. But no, I'm not against someone owning a gun.
But the point was a good one too, because there are people who are against owning guns, and none of that viewpoint is represented up here on
I have a
the
comment on that.
panel.
If I have a
Okay.
comment. In the years I've been teaching, over 10,000 people, 70% of them have been women. Single moms, couples, things like that. I have had numerous instances where by the time they got done with the class, because we put a heavy emphasis on responsibility in it, I've had people, and a number of women particularly, but it's also been couples, who go, now that we really understand all the responsibility goes with this, I don't think we're ready to have a gun in the house. And my answer is not to try and convince them to get one. My answer is, if you acknowledge those responsibilities and you don't feel you're ready for them, then you shouldn't have a gun in the house. And oftentimes I've suggested in those instances that they not get a gun, because all they do, they are wielding a power which they truly do not control. So to answer your question, even for law-abiding citizens, there are instances where I would agree you shouldn't get a gun for home.
I would have to agree with that as well. I don't think that a person should have a gun just for the sake of having a gun. I think you should know how to use it if you're going to have one, and I think you should know how to safeguard it and protect it, because if you have a gun in your house and you don't know how to use it and somebody breaks in, you've pretty much just armed your opponent. So you would probably have been better off to not have it at all.
That was a very good question, and I think that most of the group here, all the group would agree that training is very important. Knowing what you're doing and how to use a gun is very important. John.
I'd just like to let the young lady know that although I firmly support my boss's position, and I was an NRA member, went through firearms training as a Boy Scout, and hunted many years ago. After I got married, my wife was adamantly against a firearm in the house, and I gave up shooting, and I do not own a firearm today, because in our situation it was inappropriate because of her fears of it. And even after offering for training and things like that, it doesn't change my position on it, but I certainly don't think that everyone should have a gun in their home.
Tad?
Just as kind of a comment about why I like Coeur d'Alene, having been a retired police officer, I've had people ask me about, did I get my permit to carry a concealed weapon, and my comment has always been, if I thought I needed to carry a concealed weapon, I probably wouldn't want to move there. So I do have a gun in my home, and I would certainly use it to defend myself. But again, I think one of the things, and we talked about how to use a gun, but certainly more important is when. And that's where people like Bob Smith, I think, again, back to that education, years ago it was not out of fashion. It was very commonplace that it was almost a rite of passage. You went to some kind of NRA-sponsored event or whatever to learn about weapons and gun safety and so on. And of course now, certainly depending on the area of the country, things like that are frowned upon because, some people don't want you to have weapons at all. And, maybe we needed somebody like Rosie O'Donnell who, the famous that didn't want people to have firearms, but she had a bodyguard for her children and she wanted him to get a gun permit, which I thought was the height of hypocrisy. That, those of us that can't afford a bodyguard, she wants to take our guns away, but since she can afford a bodyguard, she wants him armed.
Well, I have to take and exude executive privilege. It's 2:30 and we're out of time. So on that note, I would like to thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank the panelists and one of our guest speakers who's still with us. Thank you for contributing to this discussion.
Thank you.